Königsberg, East Prussia, 1781. A sealed manuscript, pages written with trembling hands, words that no man had dared to write before. The lines said something impossible. It is not the world that governs your mind. It is your mind that governs the world. The man who wrote this was not a mystic. He was Immanuel Kant, the most rigorous philosopher of his time, and he had just discovered the most dangerous secret in the universe. For centuries, humanity had lived a fundamental lie. We believed we were victims of reality, that we are born into a fixed, immutable world where things simply are the way they are, that our role is to adapt, to suffer, to resist. But Kant had discovered something that would shatter this illusion forever. He had found proof that every color you see, every shape you perceive, every experience you live, does not exist out there as you believed. It exists because your mind is creating it, moment by moment. Your brain is not a passive receiver. It is an active factory, a reality-building machine that never stops. The space where you believe you are in is not a physical place. It is a structure of your consciousness. The time you believe is passing is not an external force. It is a function of your mind, even your past. That story you believe defines you is a mental reconstruction that your present consciousness is constantly editing. Kant had discovered that you are the unconscious architect of your own experience, and if you are the unconscious architect, you can become the conscious architect. The night he finished writing this revelation, Kant knew he had crossed a line. Not only had he changed philosophy, he had revealed the most radical power that any human being possesses, the power to rebuild their reality from within. And if you fully understand what Kant discovered in those forbidden pages, your world will never be a prison again, because once you know that your mind creates what you experience, everything becomes possible.
The prisoner of Königsberg who liberated the world, Immanuel Kant never left Königsberg, not once in his 80 years of life. For most people, that would be a prison. For Kant, it was the perfect laboratory where he would discover how the human mind really works. While other philosophers traveled across Europe seeking answers in ancient books and academic discussions, Kant remained motionless in his hometown and traveled inward, toward the only place where he could truly find the truth, his own consciousness. Kant's life was an experiment in total control. He woke up at exactly 5 a.m. He ate the same breakfast every day. He taught at the university following the same rhythm, and every afternoon at 3:30, he went out to walk the same route for exactly 1 hour. His neighbors joked that they could set their clocks by observing the philosopher's habits. They didn't know they were witnessing the most rigorous method ever. Applied to the study of the human mind, Kant had understood something crucial. To discover how consciousness works, he needed to eliminate all external variables. His extreme routine wasn't an obsession. It was a methodology. Each identical day allowed him to observe with microscopic clarity how his mind processed, organized, and created his experience of reality. Son of a harness maker, he came from a humble but deeply religious family. His mother, Anna Regina, used to take him as a child to walk through the countryside, pointing out plants, flowers, stars. "Look, Immanuel," she would say, "do you see how each thing has its perfect place in the world?" But little Kant already intuited something disturbing. What if the perfect place of each thing wasn't in the world, but in the mind that observed it? This question would haunt him for decades. He studied theology, physics, mathematics, philosophy, but no discipline gave him the answer he sought. How is it possible that humans have knowledge of the world? The official answer was simple. Our senses capture information from the outside, and our brain processes it. We are like mirrors that passively reflect external reality. But there was a gigantic problem with this explanation. If we really were passive receivers of information, why can two people look at exactly the same situation and experience completely different realities? Why can the same event be traumatic for one and liberating for another? Kant observed this in his own city. Königsberg was a commercial port where people of all nationalities converged. Russians, Poles, Germans, Lithuanians, all living in the same physical city, but inhabiting completely different worlds. A Russian merchant saw in the market an opportunity for wealth. A Polish mystic saw in the same streets a place of passage toward the sacred. A German academic saw her city of knowledge and culture, the same Königsberg. Three totally different realities. And there Kant had his first revelation. The reality that each person experiences doesn't come from the outside. It comes from the internal structures of their mind. But this was just the beginning. What he was about to discover would shake all the foundations of Western philosophy. And when he finally understood it, that day in 1781, he knew he had forever changed the way humans see themselves. We were no longer victims of the world. We were its unconscious creators, the day the mind dethroned the world. The exact moment of discovery came when Kant was 57 years old. He had spent decades studying the most fundamental problem of philosophy. How is it possible that we have true knowledge of the world? The rationalists said everything comes from pure reason. The empiricists insisted everything comes from the senses. But both groups shared an assumption they had never questioned, that there exists a real world out there, independent of us, and that our job is to know it as it is. Kant realized that this assumption was the problem. What if it were the other way around? That afternoon in 1781, while writing in his study, he had what he himself called his Copernican revolution. Just as Copernicus had put the sun at the center of the solar system instead of Earth, Kant was going to put the mind at the center of reality instead of the external world. Until now, he wrote with trembling hands, it was admitted that all our knowledge had to be governed by objects. But let's try to see if we don't progress more in metaphysical tasks by supposing that objects are governed by our knowledge. In other words, it's not your mind that adapts to the world. It's the world that adapts to your mind. But this was much more radical than it sounds. Kant wasn't saying that we simply interpret reality differently. He was saying that the reality you experience, space, time, causality, objects, everything, is literally constructed by the innate structures of your mind. Think of it this way. When you look at a red apple, you're not seeing a real red apple that exists independently of you. You're seeing the result of your mind taking chaotic sensory data and organizing it using innate categories like object, color, shape, space, time. The red apple doesn't exist without your mind to create it. This means you never know things in themselves. You only know things as they appear after your mind has processed, organized, and structured them. Kant called this the distinction between phenomena, what appears, and noumena, the thing in itself. We can only know phenomena. Noumena remain forever beyond our reach. It was an idea so disturbing that Kant himself took years to fully accept its implications. If the human mind is what structures all possible experience, then concepts like space, time, and causality are not characteristics of the real world. They are the inevitable lenses through which any human mind must see reality. This explains why mathematics and logic work so perfectly to describe the world, not because the world is mathematical, but because our mind is inherently mathematical. We don't discover the laws of nature out there. We project them from the deep structures of our consciousness. That afternoon, Kant understood that he had solved philosophical problems that had tormented humanity for millennia. But he had also opened a terrifying and liberating possibility. If your mind actively creates the reality you experience, then you have much more power than you ever imagined to transform that reality. The prisoner of Königsberg had discovered that we are all unconscious architects of our own worlds. And once you realize this, you can no longer pretend to be a victim of circumstances that at some deep level, your own consciousness is helping to create the secret structures of your mind. Once Kant understood that the mind actively constructs reality, he needed to decipher exactly how this process occurs. For years, he dedicated himself to mapping what he called the a priori structures of human consciousness. These are the innate templates that your mind uses to organize all possible experience. The first structure he identified was space. When you look around and see objects here and there, near and far, up and down, you're not perceiving characteristics of the external world. You're experiencing the inevitable way your mind organizes sensory information. Space isn't out there. It's a structure of your consciousness. Kant demonstrated this with a simple thought experiment. Try to imagine an object that exists but isn't anywhere in space. It's impossible, not because objects need to be in space, but because your mind can't process object information without using its innate spatial template. The same happens with time. The events you experience as before, now, and after aren't following a temporal sequence that exists independently of you. They're being organized by the innate temporal structure of your mind. Kant realized this explained one of the deepest mysteries of human existence. Why does time seem to accelerate when you're enjoying yourself and slow down when you suffer? Because time isn't an external entity that flows independently of your consciousness. It's an active function of your mind, and that function can be modified by your internal state. But the most fascinating structures Kant discovered were what he called categories of understanding. These are the conceptual templates your mind uses to convert chaotic sensory data into coherent experience. Unity, your capacity to see multiple sensations as one object. Reality, your tendency to experience certain sensations as real and others as imaginary. Negation, your ability to recognize the absence of something. Limitation, your capacity to establish boundaries between different experiences. Substance, your tendency to see a permanent core behind changing characteristics. Causality, your compulsion to seek causes for all effects. These categories aren't optional. Every functional human mind must use them to process experience. They're like the basic operating system of consciousness. But here's the most powerful revelation. Although these structures are universal for all humans, the specific way you apply them is completely personal. Two people can use the same category of causality and arrive at totally different explanations for the same event. One sees external causes, another sees internal causes. One seeks mechanical causes, another seeks psychological causes. And this difference in the application of mental structures is what creates completely different experiential worlds. Kant had discovered that each person lives in a unique universe, constructed by the interaction between the universal structures of the human mind and the personal way of applying those structures. This means that when you change the way you apply these mental categories, you literally change the world you experience. If you change your causality pattern from seeking external causes to recognizing internal causes, your experience of reality transforms radically. If you modify your use of the reality category from seeing certain thoughts as objective facts to recognizing them as mental constructions, your freedom expands exponentially. Kant had found the secret levers of human experience, and once you know where those levers are, you can begin to operate them consciously. Why your past is not what you think. Kant's most disturbing discovery came when he applied his theory to memory and personal experience. If the mind actively constructs all experience, what does this mean? For your memories, for your personal history, for the narrative you've constructed about who you are. Kant realized that even your past is a mental construction that is constantly being updated by the structures of your present consciousness. You don't have direct access to what really happened. You only have access to the reconstruction that your current mind makes of fragmented memory data, organized through your present mental categories. This means that when you remember your childhood, you're not accessing neutral files stored somewhere in your brain. You're actively recreating those events, using the conceptual and emotional structures you have now. That's why the same event from your past can seem traumatic during one period of your life and liberating during another. Not because the event has changed, but because the mental structures you use to construct the memory have evolved. Kant observed this in his own life. For years, he remembered his strict religious education as something oppressive that had limited his intellectual freedom. But later, he began to remember it as the necessary discipline that had given him the mental structure to make his philosophical discoveries. The objective event was the same, but the mental categories he used to process it had changed, literally, creating a different past. This led Kant to a revolutionary conclusion. You are not a prisoner of your personal history because your personal history is not a fixed set of objective facts. It's a fluid mental construction that you can modify by changing the structures through which you process it. But there was something even more radical in this understanding. If your mind is constantly reconstructing your past using present structures, then your personal identity, that sense of being the same person through time, is also a mental construction. The you that existed 5 years ago and the you that exists now are not the same objective entity connected by real continuity. They are different constructions of a consciousness that uses the category of substance to create the illusion of a permanent personal core. Kant called this the transcendental ego, the organizing function of consciousness that creates the experience of being a coherent I, but which itself is not a thing or entity. It's like the invisible director of a movie who never appears on screen but coordinates all the action. This understanding freed Kant from something that had limited philosophy for centuries, the need to find a true self that was essential, immutable, existing independently of experience. There is no such self. There is only the active function of consciousness, creating moment by moment the experience of being someone. And this means you have radical freedom to reconstruct both your past and your identity, not through self-deception or fantasy, but by recognizing that what you considered fixed facts about yourself were actually flexible mental constructions. When Kant fully understood this, something fundamental changed in him. He stopped seeing himself as a victim of his personal history and began to experience himself as the conscious architect of his own existential narrative. And every day, during his ritual walk through the streets of Königsberg, he practiced this radical freedom, the freedom to be the conscious author of his own experience of being. He didn't change the external facts of his life. He changed the internal structures through which he processed those facts, and that changed everything. The hidden power of your attention. One afternoon in 1784, Kant made a discovery that would transform his understanding of human power. He realized that attention is not simply the focus of consciousness, but the active mechanism through which the mind constructs reality moment by moment. During his daily walks through Königsberg, he had begun experimenting with what he called directed attention. Instead of letting his mind wander automatically, he consciously decided which aspects of his experience to focus his consciousness on. The results were immediate and surprising. When he directed his attention toward the harmonious aspects of the city, the balanced architecture, the natural rhythms of people, the ordered patterns of commerce, his experience of Königsberg transformed into something like a living symphony. When he directed his attention toward the problematic aspects, poverty, social conflicts, the deterioration of some buildings, the same city became a landscape of suffering and decay. But it wasn't that he was interpreting the city differently. It was that by directing his attention selectively, he was literally constructing different cities using the same sensory data. Kant understood that attention is the fundamental construction tool of consciousness. Where you direct your attention, there you direct the organizing categories of your mind. And where you direct those categories, there you create the specific structure of your experience. It's not that positive or negative things are out there waiting to be discovered. It's that your directed attention activates different organizing templates that construct positive or negative experiences using the same basic material. This explains something he had observed in his university students. Two students could attend exactly the same class, hear exactly the same words, and one would leave inspired while the other left bored. The difference wasn't in the objective class. It was in how each student directed their attention and, therefore, in what type of experience they constructed. But Kant discovered something even more powerful. Directed attention not only affects your present experience, but modifies the mental structures you'll use to construct future experiences. Every time you consciously direct your attention toward patterns of harmony, you strengthen the mental templates that detect and construct harmony. Every time you consciously direct your attention toward patterns of possibility, you strengthen the mental templates that detect and construct possibilities. It's like training perceptual muscles. Attention repeatedly directed towards certain types of patterns develops your mind's capacity to create those patterns in future experiences. Kant began practicing what he called attentional discipline. During specific periods each day, He consciously directed his attention toward aspects of his experience he wanted to amplify: beauty, order, possibility, connection, meaning. It wasn't superficial positive thinking, it was systematic training of the reality-constructing structures of his consciousness. The results were so dramatic, they transformed not only his philosophical experience, but his entire life experience. His health improved, his relationships deepened, his intellectual creativity expanded exponentially, not because he had changed the external circumstances of his life, but because he had changed the internal architecture from which he constructed his experience of those circumstances. And this revealed to him the most practical secret of his philosophy. You have direct control over the tool that constructs your reality moment by moment, your attention. And when you learn to use that tool consciously, you become the deliberate architect of your own experience. It doesn't matter what's happening out there. What matters is how you direct the tool that constructs your experience of what's happening, and that tool is always under your control. The lost mental technology. In his later years, Kant developed what he considered the most practical aspect of his philosophy, a systematic system for consciously using the reality-constructing structures of the mind. He called it mental technology, specific methods for deliberately operating the categories and structures that your mind uses automatically to create experience. The first method was what Kant called categorical interrogation. When you find yourself in an experience you don't like, instead of resisting it or trying to change it externally, you ask yourself, what mental category am I using to construct this experience? For example, if you're experiencing a situation as unfair, you ask yourself, am I using the category of causality to look for someone to blame? Am I using the category of limitation to define what's possible? Am I using the category of reality to make my thoughts about the situation more real than the situation itself? Once you identify the dominant category, you can consciously experiment with applying a different category. Instead of external causality, looking for culprits, you apply internal causality, looking for what in you is co-creating this experience. Instead of fixed limitation, this is what's possible, you apply fluid limitation. This is what seems possible from my current perspective. Kant discovered that this simple category shift could completely transform the experience of any situation, without changing anything about the external circumstances. The second method was conscious temporal construction. Since time is a mental structure, you can consciously modify your temporal experience. When you're anxious, you're using the temporal structure to project present problems toward imaginary futures. You can consciously reconfigure your temporal construction by focusing on the only moment where you actually have power. Now, when you're depressed, you're using the temporal structure to make past events more real than your present experience. You can consciously reconfigure your temporal construction by remembering that your past is a present mental reconstruction, not a fixed fact. The third method was conscious spatialization. Since space is a mental structure, you can consciously modify your spatial experience. When you feel trapped in a situation, you're using the spatial structure to create an experience of confinement. You can consciously expand your spatial construction by remembering that psychological space is more fluid than physical space. When you feel separated from others, you're using the spatial structure to create an experience of distance. You can consciously modify your spatial construction by recognizing that psychological separation is a function of your mind, not an objective reality. But the most powerful method Kant developed was what he called constructive metacognition, the capacity to consciously observe the process by which your mind is constructing experience in real time. Instead of being identified with the experiences your mind creates, you learn to observe the construction process itself. You realize that you are the conscious space where construction occurs, not the products of construction. This perspective gives you radical freedom. You can observe your mind creating experiences of anxiety without identifying with the anxiety. You can observe your mind creating experiences of limitation without identifying with the limitation. And from that perspective of conscious observer, you can begin to deliberately influence the construction process. Kant had discovered that you don't need to change your mind or eliminate negative thoughts. You only need to remember that you are the consciousness that observes the mind working, not the mind itself. And from that position, you have direct access to the levers that control how your experience is constructed, moment by moment. The Infinite. Legacy of a Free Mind. On February 12, 1804, Immanuel Kant died in the same house where he had lived for decades, in the same city he had never left. His last words were, "It is good." He wasn't referring only to his death. He was referring to his entire life as an experiment in mental freedom. Kant had demonstrated that you can radically change your experience of reality without changing external circumstances, that you can live in the same place, with the same routines, apparently with the same limitations, and still experience an infinite expansion of your inner world. His philosophical revolution wasn't just academic theory. It was a practical manual for human liberation. For more than 2 centuries, his ideas have transformed not only philosophy, but psychology, neuroscience, quantum physics. Modern scientists have confirmed what Kant intuited, that the observer and the observed are not separate entities, that consciousness plays an active role in the construction of reality. But the most important thing about his legacy isn't what changed in universities. It's what can change in your life when you truly understand his discoveries. When you understand that your mind is not a passive mirror that reflects a fixed external reality, but an active instrument that constructs your experience moment by moment, everything transforms. You stop being a victim of circumstances and become a conscious participant in the creation of your experience. You stop seeking happiness in external changes and start creating it from the internal structures of your consciousness. You stop feeling limited by your past and start recognizing it as a mental construction you can reconfigure. Every morning when you wake up, you're not waking up to a fixed world that exists independently of you. You're waking up to the creative process through which your consciousness is going to construct a world during the next few hours. And that means every morning you have the opportunity to be the conscious architect of your own reality. Not through magical thinking or self-deception, but through scientific understanding of how your mind really works. The structures are there. The categories are operating. Construction is happening. The only question is, are you going to participate consciously in the process, or are you going to remain identified with its products? Kant chose conscious participation, and that choice transformed a small provincial professor into one of the most influential thinkers in history. But his true achievement wasn't changing philosophy. It was demonstrating that any human being can access the radical freedom that comes from understanding the constructive nature of consciousness. That freedom doesn't depend on external circumstances. It doesn't depend on social privileges. It doesn't depend on special education. It depends only on your willingness to recognize that you are much more powerful than you believed, that you are not a victim of reality, but its unconscious co-creator, and that once you realize this, you can begin to co-create consciously. Kant never left Königsberg, but his mind traveled to the limits of the possible universe, and he discovered that those limits are in you. If these words have resonated in some deep part of your consciousness, it's because you're already beginning to remember the power you always had, the power to be the conscious architect of your own experience.